broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, welcome and good afternoon, everyone. We're so pleased that you could join us today for our webinar. Today we'll be discussing how new laws, specifically in Minnesota and Hawaii, give Native American survivors of childhood sexual abuse an opportunity to seek justice. My name is Rose Quilt, and I'm a program specialist with the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center. And today we'll be joined with two special guests from Anderson Associates, Ms. Sarah Odegaard and Mr. Patrick Wall, who I will introduce a little bit later. But before we turn this over, I just want to cover a few housekeeping items. Just so everybody's aware, the webinar will be about an hour and a half long today. And during the webinar, please feel free to ask questions. The presenters would really like to engage in dialogue as the presentation goes on. So they're really, I mean, unless you have questions, you know, if you want to just reserve for the latter part, that's fine as well. But they're really welcoming questions as the presentation continues. And also at the end of the webinar, you will receive a link for an evaluation. So we hope that you'll take a few moments to participate and provide us with your feedback. Just note that it's completely anonymous and completely voluntary. And then finally, Tang Chim, our IT specialist, will quickly provide an overview for the GoToMeeting system and how to operate the control panel that you see in the upper left, or I'm sorry, upper right-hand side of your screen. So if you have any questions, he'll go over how you can ask questions. So I'll turn this over to Tang. Tang?
Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. For those of you that have not participated on one of our webinars, I just want to take a moment to bring your attention to the control panel that Rose mentioned that should be in the top right-hand corner of your screen. So the two sections I want to highlight is the audio section and the questions section. So in the audio section, at any time during the webinar, if you find that the audio seems to be going in and out, or if you're having issues, you have the option of either switching to the telephone so you can dial in and actually listen in, or what I actually recommend is click on the telephone and then really quickly click back on the mic and speakers. And what that will do is it will disconnect the audio portion and then try to reestablish your connection to the audio, to the system again, to get a better connection. And the other section is the question section. So as Rose mentioned, feel free to type in all of your questions, whether they be technical or content related, into there, and we're going to make every effort to answer every single question that comes across. So other than that, I hope you enjoy today's training, and here we go.
Thank you, Tang. So again, very recently, states like Minnesota and Hawaii have extended their statute of limitations to allow victims of childhood sexual abuse to bring forward civil claims against their perpetrators. Many of you who are familiar with the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center understand that NIWRC is dedicated to reclaiming the sovereignty of Native nations and safeguarding Native women and children. So we're really honored again to have Mr. Patrick Wall and Ms. Sarah Odegaard. Sarah Odegaard is an attorney and Patrick Wall is an advocate, and they both work with the Minnesota law firm of Jeff Anderson and Associates. Patrick will discuss his work with the Native American communities in Alaska and South Dakota to file claims against their perpetrators and against religious institutions for covering up abuse by priests. So without further ado, I would like to welcome both Patrick and Sarah. I'm not sure who's going to speak first, so please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Rose.
Hello, everyone. This is Patrick Wall. We're talking to you today from St. Paul, Minnesota, and it is a wonderful opportunity because as a former priest and as a young monk at St. John's Abbey, I was sent to work with the Ojibwe in northern Minnesota. I knew absolutely nothing. And as you know, there is nothing worse than a white guy who just happened to have read Black Elk Speaks, who thinks they understand Native ways. They, in fact, are probably the worst thing that could ever walk on to a res or try to reach out and help people. And I was one of those guys. One of the great things that happened to me is after I left ministry, and I've worked on childhood sexual abuse cases amongst clergy since 1991, so I do have a little bit of a skewed view of the world, I have to admit, seeing the darkness that does exist. But the great thing that I got to see in Alaska, in South Dakota, in California, and many other places, is the healing that can happen once a survivor can face the truth that they were abused as a child. And I do believe there is a turnaround, there is a resurrection that can happen. Sometimes the legal system works, and sometimes it doesn't. I'm sure you've had experiences on the criminal side where things did not work. I too have had that experience. On the civil side, I've had good experiences in Alaska and bad experiences in South Dakota. In Alaska, I had the absolute privilege to work with Athabascan and Yupik survivors, and Elsie Boudreau, I think, taught me more than any other single person in Alaska. To know that, unfortunately, religious institutions specifically targeted Native communities and sent perpetrators to live amongst them for decades and decades. And it's just by literally a coinky-dink of history that it became exposed in the mid-2000s. And come to find out that over 40 priests, Roman Catholic priests, were sent to Western Alaska amongst a very isolated community. I mean, you got to remember, this is before the internet. There was no such thing as having a webinar. The telephones didn't work. People were so isolated, and that's where specifically Jesuits were sent from all over the world. My first thing that I had to fight in the mid-2000s when I went there was a case against Father Jules Convert, and they began their defense by saying they didn't even know who he was. The tough reality is that they not only knew who he was, but he was the Jesuit regional superior from France that was sent to Fairbanks, Alaska. Some of those cases worked out well. Many people received some healing and some form of civil justice in it. I did not have that experience in South Dakota in the late 2000s, working up cases there. And we were absolutely defeated by the statute of limitations and by the reform that happened there. So there are hundreds of kids, again, that were sexually abused by religious figures. And I like to call it, by the way, it's not just religious figures. I think perpetrators in general, the one key little element I'd love to pass along to you is that they have an illusion of integrity. And this illusion is so powerful. It absolutely puts the parents at ease. It puts the family members at ease. It puts the potential victim at ease. And that's how that perpetrator can get to them. So the illusion of integrity, I would counsel you to consider that as the core of how childhood sexual abuse ultimately happens. So South Dakota was a bad experience. But what has recently happened, and I think it's important, and this is why I'm so happy to be able to talk about this today with you and to have Sarah explain the laws to you, is we have a confluence that's going on that's never happened before. We have both civil legislation that has changed, and we've had bankruptcies that are happening right now that also give very small windows of opportunity. So, and it's all around the country that all of a sudden it started to happen, and it's happening to close to very large Native communities and nations, and that's why it's so different. So at this point, I'm pretty much going to try and shut up as much as I can. I realize, in Alaska, a guy like me is called a gussock. A a guy, basically a white guy who comes in and tries to help. And it's time for you to get some information, and obviously we're more than happy to answer questions as we go along today, but if this is specifically, I need you to know that Roman Catholic institutions targeted perpetrators to go and serve on nations and reservations in the Indian country, and that is something that is not being discussed too much. And I really hope this legislation helps to bring this whole discussion forward.
Well, thank you, Patrick, and thanks to everyone on the webinar for being a part of this today. We think this is a very important topic and a very important time to get the word out about these new laws. Patrick briefly covered, and what I'll get into detail here today, cover two new laws in both the states of Hawaii and Minnesota that directly impact survivors of childhood sexual abuse. And here at our law firm, that's exclusively what we do. We represent those who were sexually abused as a child against their perpetrators and the institutions that employed and enabled those perpetrators. So first, let's talk about Hawaii. In the case of both Hawaii and Minnesota, these laws are exclusively related to civil laws. Now, the civil justice system is entirely separate and different from the criminal justice system. So in the criminal justice system, we're talking about criminal penalties, time in prison. The perpetrator is prosecuted. Here, using the civil justice system, we're both able to achieve justice for survivors through monetary recovery, through settlements, as well as sometimes using the civil justice system to get non-monetary changes, such as policy changes. So the civil justice system is for recovery of damages, of harm. So we're not talking about the criminal system, we're talking about the civil system. So in Hawaii, and I'll talk through this new law first in Hawaii, there the legislature and the governor signed into law we call it a window because it's a certain amount of time under the laws of Hawaii when survivors can come forward and bring a civil claim, a lawsuit, against the perpetrator and the institution that enabled or employed the perpetrator. And in the civil justice system, there are things called statutes of limitations. These provide time limits when lawsuits can be brought. In the past, the time limits in both Hawaii and Minnesota, and frankly around the country, have been very restrictive for survivors of childhood sexual abuse. That's starting to change. We're starting to see the laws and the legislatures match what we know to be a reality for survivors of childhood sexual abuse, that it often takes years, sometimes decades, to be able to come out from silence, from shame, from guilt, to really understand that they were abused as a child and how that abuse has impacted their life over the years or decades. So the laws are starting to change to say, if you didn't come forward in the past and your time expired to bring a claim, you can now go back and bring a claim, a lawsuit, for only a certain limited amount of time. In Hawaii, this law passed in April 2012. It's set to close, the window is going to close in April of 2014. So that's an important time before which survivors of abuse of childhood sexual abuse must come forward if they were abused years or decades ago to say, this happened to me and I want to do something about it. Now, in Hawaii, there's some technical details in this new law, and I can talk through those a little bit. But in both Hawaii and Minnesota and anywhere else in the country, if you yourself were sexually abused as a child, or you know someone who may have been sexually abused as a child, the first call is always and must always be to some sort of law enforcement agency, okay? But what we're talking about here is once there's been a report, or once there's been acknowledgement that, yes, I was abused as a child, you have rights under the law to bring a case civilly. And so these laws give you those rights, and that's what we want to make sure you understand today. So in the case of Hawaii, it's important, very important, for survivors to act now. There's no time to wait. It's February of 2014. The opportunity window closes at the end of April of 2014. That means if you or people you know may have been sexually abused as a child in Hawaii, if you want to do something civilly as a part of the civil justice system, bring a lawsuit, you must do so now. Going forward, if you didn't bring your case before April of this year, you would have to file a lawsuit before you would turn 26 years old, or 3 years from discovery. What that means to us as lawyers is that that's a very limited chance to bring a lawsuit. And so if you're not of a young age, now is the time. Okay? So a couple of the technical details of the law, and this typically applies to civil laws regarding childhood sexual abuse, is that the claims you are going to bring against a institution, here we're talking a lot about the Roman Catholic Church. Clergy abuse cases make up a large percentage of our work, and in Native communities there certainly were and continue to be a high number of clergy and clerics on reservations and in working in Native communities, and so there may be opportunities for claims against institutions, religious and otherwise. When you seek to go forward in a lawsuit against an institution, there are certain things required under the law, and those are described in this PowerPoint slide. But those things, frankly, are something that are our job as lawyers to figure out once you do go and call a lawyer. It's a lawyer's job to say, will the facts of your case fit into what is required by the law? Some of those things are in Hawaii grossly negligent. Now that's a legal term that's described here. Essentially, we want to make sure there's a duty, there's a responsibility that the institution and owed to you as a person. And so that would be a lawyer's job to figure that out. The important message and important theme through these laws is making the call to make sure you preserve your rights, you hold on to your rights and know what they are. The other part of the Hawaii law is a certificate of merit. This is also a requirement in California and other places around the country. It merely means that a survivor of abuse must be evaluated by a psychologist, someone who determines that there's a reasonable basis to believe that the person was sexually abused as a child. It's a small hurdle, and it's often not required. The Minnesota law doesn't require it. It's, again, something that would be organized, sort of made possible by a lawyer you contact in this situation. So not something that puts the onus on the survivor, puts the responsibility on the survivor, but again, it's on a lawyer to make that process happen. Another important development in Hawaii is that there's legislation currently being moved through the state legislature that would extend the statute of limitations to age 55. So on a previous slide, I talked about that if you don't act now within the window, you would then be subject to a statute of limitations of age 26. You'd have to bring your lawsuit before age 26. Well, the legislature is seeing that that doesn't match reality. They're trying to change that to age 55. I'll talk about in a little bit in Minnesota, they've gotten rid of the statute of limitations going forward if you were sexually abused as a child. But Hawaii, it looks like, is trying to at least extend that somewhat to really make a difference for survivors' ability to bring a civil lawsuit and have that power and right under the law until they are of age 55. Frankly, we have survivors coming to us who are 60, 70 years old, and they've never told anyone before what happened to them as a child. And that's not uncommon. So the reality is for survivors of abuse that it's very difficult to tell. So we certainly advocate for extending the statute of limitations, if not getting rid of it altogether, for childhood sexual abuse survivors. Another change would be to reduce that legal standard, the question of whether there can be a case going forward from gross negligence to negligence. Another legal term that is in the hands of the lawyer to determine if a fact pattern matches what the law says. But importantly, it would lower the bar somewhat for bringing a case, and that's important. You know, there needs to be a wider door, a bigger door open to survivors of child sexual abuse, and this is one of the important ways to do it that the Hawaii legislature is trying to do. The certificates of merit I talked about briefly are confidential. This would just put that into the law explicitly. I next want to discuss the changes in Minnesota law, which have recently allowed us to bring 2 lawsuits involving a priest who worked on reservations in Minnesota. The Minnesota Child Victims Act was passed in May of 2013, so May of last year. And just like the Hawaii law, this is also a civil law, so it involves bringing a lawsuit for money damages and damages for harm for childhood sexual abuse. And it also, similar to Hawaii, opens a window of opportunity. It opens the statute for 3 years if your claim was previously time barred, if a lawyer told you you had run out of time to bring a case. You now have 3 years until May of 2016 to bring a civil lawsuit if you were sexually abused as a child against the perpetrator and the institution that enabled and employed that perpetrator. Most importantly, and which we think is just should be done around the country, is that the statute of limitations for survivors who were at the time of the law passed under age 24, if they were sexually abused as a child, or any child going forward who's sexually abused as a child, there is no statute of limitations for bringing a civil claim. There's no restriction of your rights under the law to bring a civil case for childhood sexual abuse. The language of the law in Minnesota limits to certain legal causes of action. Again, that's up to your lawyer. You would call and they would determine what claims you can bring, but the important message is that you can bring them. Just like Hawaii and Minnesota, the time to act is now. The window is up May of 2016. Before then, if you've been time barred in the past, very important to come forward and exercise your rights, bring a civil lawsuit if that's what you choose to do. In Minnesota, as I mentioned, there's no certificate of merit requirement. So again, another hurdle removed for survivors to be able to come forward and seek justice. This slide shows our Minnesota governor signing the Minnesota Child Victims Act into law. And it was a very important day for survivors of child sexual abuse, particularly here in Minnesota, obviously. So again, this emphasizes the retroactivity, the going backwards, the old cases that can now be brought. That time period expires in May 2016. So an important message to act now. I think I'm going to hand it back to Patrick to talk about some of the bankruptcies that are going on around the country. And again, I want to reiterate what Rose said. If there are questions at any time as we're going through this material, please don't hesitate to type those in and send them our way. We're more than happy to explain anything we're talking about here today, sometimes using technical legal terms or something that may be confusing. We're happy to clarify any of it. So back to you, Patrick.
All right. This is the one bankruptcy that honestly got my greatest attention because of the vastness, obviously, of the Navajo Nation. The Navajo Nation has a really well-developed legal system, and in fact, some have actually been able, as survivors of childhood sexual abuse, have been successful in native civil court, which is different than other nations around the country. But now, all of a sudden, the Roman Catholic Bishop of Gallup, because of all of his legal problems with sexually abusing kids, had to file bankruptcy. And the Diocese of Gallup is not territorial. It's not the normal territorial area. So we're talking all the way west, to Winslow, all the way north to Red Rock and Shipwreck, and then all the way down to Glenwood. So you're crossing over into Arizona and New Mexico. This is a vast area, and there are a lot of people there. Now, there are significant issues, obviously, in this part of the world. The gangs and the drug lords are running incredible amounts of illegal chemicals and things through Indian country and causing tremendous social havoc. I mean, the amount of families that get destroyed because of this is severe. The amount of people that are also coming into first contact with some serious drugs is now very severe. And there are all kinds of social issues that get mixed up. So unfortunately, we have to be very narrow in our focus because that's what the law provides in talking about childhood sexual abuse. But we know that within that are all kinds of domestic issues, all kinds of issues with chemicals, all kinds of other social maladies, especially physical abuse and emotional abuse that come into play. But this is a very narrow, very specific help for people so that you understand that's there. And again, this is a very short window of opportunity. I don't know exactly when bar date, that's the fancy word that bar date is the word that the court uses for when you have to bring your claim. But I suspect that bar date is usually around 6 months, and I don't even know if they published that yet. So it's basically it's a very short period of time that anyone who was sexually abused as a child, and the lawyer is able to find either the perpetrator and or the organization that was responsible for that perpetrator. They have to get that claim in fairly soon. So I wanted to bring that to your attention, because I think a lot of people have missed that completely, and there really hasn't been a whole lot of chatter, at least with the people I talk to, that they're even aware that this has happened. Also, I wanted to
Patrick?
go ahead.
Yeah, just a question. So you mentioned that within the Navajo Nation there has been successful suits in the Native Civil Court. What kind of examples, or do you have examples of that?
Yeah, it's a specific case that we had, and of Roman Catholic priests that were assigned to work in the Navajo Nation, and they were able to win up through the Navajo Supreme Court to establish responsibility and basic negligence against the priest and against the Franciscan friars that sent him there for the childhood sexual abuse suffered by the resident of the nation. So but that took years and years to get through. Honestly, the hardest problem there is to collect damages against the Franciscans. And even though it's a great legal win, as far as actually getting an award to the client, that is a whole nother issue. And that's the reason I bring up the avenue of the bankruptcy court, because the one thing the bankruptcy court is good at is getting people the best award that they possibly can. So. What's your...
Okay, and then just another... Yeah.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Yeah, we have a question from one of our panelists, or from one of our participants. And her question is, if a victim has moved from Minnesota or Hawaii to our community and wants to prosecute, will this be handled locally through our legal services, or is there someone designated that they must contact or that they should contact?
Well, it comes back down to where it happened, doesn't it?
Exactly. So it's a great question, and typically the location where you would bring a lawsuit would be where the sexual abuse occurred, the state where it occurred, the county where it occurred. In the case of when we're bringing lawsuits against institutions, whether it's a diocese or some other organization or entity, we can oftentimes bring the lawsuit where the organization, the entity, is doing its business. So it's important, I think, to contact a lawyer in the state where it happened, where the abuse occurred, because they probably have the most familiarity with the laws in that state. And so, you know, by example, I'll talk about two recent cases we brought in Minnesota, and those were brought in Minnesota because the abuse occurred here in the state on the reservation and otherwise. So hopefully that answers the person's question.
I'll give you an example maybe of a pattern that I have seen and know about is kids who were sexually abused at Red Lake or White Earth in northern Minnesota. A lot of times those guys, if they were Roman Catholic priests, they were monks from St. John's Abbey, which is in Collegeville, Minnesota in Stearns County. So even if the person had left Red Lake or White Earth, and even if they don't have their status amongst the tribe squared away for whatever reason, they still have the ability, because of the legislation, to bring a civil action at this point for childhood sexual abuse, because St. John's or because that entity is in Minnesota. You know, one of the other things that is just, there's an amazing parallel here between different service organizations such as the Boy Scouts or the Girl Scouts or the Salvation Army. Perpetrators, and I'll be straight with you, the vast majority of perpetrators are men. There are very few, in my experience, women who are perpetrators of sexual abuse, but there are. But if you just look at the raw numbers, we're talking about men who sexually abuse both boys and girls. And the distinction there is a pedophile or an ephebophile. Pedophile being a person who's attracted to a prepubescent child, and ephebophile, a person who's attracted to a minor, post-pubescent minor are the fancy words that we make the distinction there. And one of the reasons we make that distinction is because we find that perpetrators tend to go after those specific types of age groups. So it's honestly a luck of the draw sometimes. If you happen to be a female or a male of a certain age that is the target population of that perpetrator, they're going to try and find you. And they're going to also try to find their ways into certain organizations that give them greater access to the children that they're interested in. So this is not about a bashing of religion or service industries or education or government or anything else. This is just the hard, cold reality that years and decades now of experience that we've found that there have been at least 6,000 Roman Catholic priests who've sexually abused children since 1950 in the United States, and that we have found because of our litigation that the Boy Scouts kept secret files, and they too moved perpetrators around and allowed them, even if they had previous knowledge, they allowed them then to be leaders in new states and move. So it's the same type of institutional behavior. It really is, it's colorless, it's classless, it's faithless, it's just the way that institutions that allow perpetrators to move and breathe, that's how they act. Circling back to the original question, yes, you can actually honestly leave the United States and still bring your claim. But you need to act, and you make sure you need to get a lawyer's opinion on that. Wanted to also, so that time doesn't get away too far, talk about the Diocese of Helena bankruptcy that just occurred, and I think of the Blackfeet, I think of the institutions that existed in western Montana. There's a lot of gussics, there's a lot of white guys who basically flee and try to find a new life in western Montana. And there has been quite a bit of evidence that kids were sexually molested. And if you're in that target population and you are in a vulnerable place where you don't have a lot of protections either by family or by parents for whatever reason, then these chicken hawks will find those kids. And I don't use the word chicken hawk lightly. These guys are predators. They have everything they do, everything they think about is all in the calculation of sexual abuse. And they're thinking both past, present, and future. They're thinking about how to control the past kids that they sexually abused, how to search out ones right now for the future, and then setting up in the future for the kids that they're hitting. So it's all consuming. This is pretty much all that they do. And they do this, again, under the illusion of integrity. And it just happens to be because of litigation against the Jesuits and in western Montana that the Diocese of Helena has now had to file bankruptcy. And this has a lot of similarities, honestly, between the Spokane bankruptcy. It has a lot of similarities with the Oregon Province, the Society of Jesus bankruptcy that I also worked on, because these guys were sent out, and they weren't the first-class Jesuits that they sent out, I have to admit. A lot of these guys, for lack of a better term, they were wingnuts, who they weren't their first-class Jesuit that they sent out to serve on the nations and in the what they would call the missions. And these guys were not supervised at all. A lot of them had already offended before they went out, is what the records show. Hence, what we have is the financial bankruptcy actually follows the moral bankruptcy. And I hope that people who were abused will still come forward not only to make their criminal complaint, but also to make their records civilly so that this doesn't happen again. I mean, ultimately, we go through all these machinations of the legal system because the one thing I can guarantee you from studying history is that the past is the prologue for the future. If we do not change what happened in the past, if we do not change our ways now, if we do not be more vigilant with our child protection, we're going to have exactly the same thing moving forward. So the past is prologue to the future, and I want our future to be different. I really want kids to have an opportunity that like they never had before. I think that's about all, unless have you have particular questions on Helena. So, past bankruptcies. And the Fairbanks bankruptcy was honestly ugly. And because of the files that finally came out, and because of the documents that finally came out, that there was a specific targeting of St. Michael's and Stebbins. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to get the pictures going. I'm a technological idiot. But the film, The Silence, is really good because it takes place with all the people that we represented in Stebbins and St. Michael's. They had 5 perpetrators in a row in that particular set of villages and out in that area. So it's an opportunity, if people can step forward, to be able to put their name forward, to be able to say it happened to them, so that they also have the chance to be able to help the generations in the future. Because the only way you can really be empathetic is to know what happened. We don't want to have a situation where some of the best people are lost. You know, we are not, in my opinion, strictly my opinion, we cannot allow the Jesuits to win. They tried to destroy the language, they tried to destroy the culture, they tried to destroy the native religion, they tried to destroy all the basic elements of native culture and all the coping mechanisms that a young Yupik or Athabascan had. And that's why we really need to continue to stand up in this as we go across the nation and as we work forward. Some of these bankruptcies, they're not magic pills in any way, shape, or form. They move slow, and this is a white man's legal system, and obviously it's to protect those who have the most amount of money. But what happens is, if enough people come forward, then there's attention brought to it, light is brought to the darkness, and all the tragedy that did occur, and I'm talking about the most radical activity and conduct I've ever seen. I had never heard of a prolapsed rectum before. We're talking about the most brutal rapes and sodomies that have ever occurred. And we're not talking about light touches. We're talking about some of the worst things you could think of to do to Native kids, to any kid, and that's what occurred. So I want to place that in its proper format, so that this is not set aside as just a bunch of people bringing forth frivolous claims and doing other things. There's a case And Rachel is public about this. Brave woman of Western Alaska. Rachel was raped by her priest, and then he basically forced her to go and get an abortion, and all kinds of absolutely moral turpitude and scandalous behavior that has happened over the years. And this is the kind of thing that we have to stop. This is a thing that cannot occur in the future. So I'm going to get off my soapbox here because I can feel myself getting angry again. But I want to let you know that this conduct is not light. This is very serious conduct that has happened and that needs to be properly recorded. And the good thing is, in this new case that we were just able to file here in Minnesota, again, the story gets to be told.
Thanks, Patrick. I'll talk to you a little bit about these cases we've filed. So these are involving a priest here in Minnesota. His name is Father Vincent Fitzgerald. And these are cases that we have been able to bring using the new Child Victims Act. So before May of 2013, the courts would have said these cases are time barred. They happened in the 60s and 70s, and they happened too long ago. Well, now the law says, and the Minnesota legislature has said, that no, these survivors have a chance to come forward and bring a lawsuit, use the civil justice system. They have a chance at justice that they hadn't had in the past. And so we are proud to work with these two survivors, Doe 19 and Doe 30. And you'll see in these, I'm sorry that 2010 case looks a little bit unclear, but what we did in 2010 is try to bring a civil case and try to use a theory of fraud to try and tell the courts, hey, you've got it wrong on the statute of limitations. But now that we're solidly in this Minnesota Child Victims Act, now we know we're on solid ground to be able to bring a claim that's timely, that won't be thrown out because of too much time passed. So this is a typical case where we are representing these two survivors, and they are, as you can see, Doe numbers, Doe 19 and Doe 30. The important thing to know is that when you contact us or a lawyer about a childhood sexual abuse case, you must know that it will be a confidential conversation. Everything you discuss with a lawyer in bringing them your potential case stays confidential. Every survivor that contacts us in our office is confidential and it's safe. So this is what we do. We know how to work with survivors. We've done it for many years, and it's really important that people know that they can contact a lawyer confidentially. No one will know that you have contacted us, and no one has to know in the future. So we're able to use the civil justice system while maintaining a person's confidentiality by using Doe pseudonyms, by using Doe names in the public documents that start a lawsuit. So here, Doe 19 and Doe 30. Father Fitzgerald, going backwards. Father Fitzgerald served on 3 reservations in Minnesota, in Lake Traverse, Leech Lake, and White Earth. And this was in the 60s and 70s, as I mentioned, in Minnesota. Here's a map that shows where he served. And he was an oblate order priest. So you'll see in the caption that says who we've sued. We have sued institutionally the Diocese of Crookston, the Oblates of Mary Immaculate. In the second case, the Diocese of New Ulm, the Diocese of Duluth, the Oblates. So there are there are different institutions that as a survivor you may not appreciate how many different institutions are controlling a perpetrator, in this case a priest. He could be operating and working at the direction of many different entities, many different institutions that have a say in what he does and where he works. Here we've got four different institutions. So the ability to bring a lawsuit and get some justice can be greater than even you may know as a survivor, as your local priest actually, in fact, is directed by many different arms and institutions above him. So we have actually brought these cases in the Twin Cities here, and that kind of goes back to the question was asked earlier and about where we bring lawsuits. So here we've brought both of the cases in the Twin Cities in St. Paul, Minnesota, because the defendant, the Oblates institution, its principal place of business, its place where it does business out of is St. Paul, is Ramsey County in St. Paul, Minnesota. Now, that is an example of the abuse happened on the reservation and happened on trips, but we were able to bring the lawsuit here in St. Paul because of the defendant's location. So, but it's still all in the state of Minnesota where the abuse occurred. So sometimes a legal question that a lawyer can answer about where exactly the case will be filed in a court, but generally the state where the abuse occurred is where a lawsuit is brought. Just one more point on these cases is that they're moving through the courts. They've just been filed recently. Another one was filed yesterday. So there's plenty of media coverage available on the internet about that, and it'll tell you more about the work we're doing. But these cases, then once we file them and bring them, we use sort of the court of public opinion. We use the media, and oftentimes you'll see us do press conferences to announce filing lawsuits, because we use that to let other survivors know that they're not alone, that this didn't just happen to them. Oftentimes we see survivors really struggling through life in their own sense that they are alone, and that maybe only this happened to only them. That's unfortunately and very tragically not often the case, particularly with clerics and clergy perpetrators. We see tens, sometimes even hundreds of survivors, of victims of a certain perpetrator. And so getting the word out there, making sure other survivors know they're not alone and this happened to others is important. And it gives us a chance to let other survivors know that there is an opportunity for them to get some justice as well.
Wanted to bring up one particular element that perpetrators like to do, and that is isolate the victim. And one way that they isolate the victim is to transport them somewhere that particular kid really wants to go, or a place where that the kid's parents or family can't afford to take them. So perpetrators traditionally will transport them, isolate them overnight in different locations. And looking at the map there, one of the things that always pains my heart, to be honest with you, is the way the law is right now. If you were abused in Sisseton and the abuse only happened there, I don't think we can help you legally, civilly, because of the way the laws are. The laws in South Dakota are so draconian.
Right.
They're so negative. They are they might as well be considered Byzantine of the 14th century rank. They're just so far behind the curve. It's unbelievable. However, if the child was transported across the line into a state where the law is good for the purposes to sexually abuse them, that's a whole nother discussion. Give you a classic example. There's a perpetrator's case in Chicago that I worked on for over a decade, Father Donald J. McGuire. Father McGuire, he honestly never really got caught in Illinois. The reason Father McGuire got in trouble is because he transported kids to Wisconsin. And in Wisconsin, he ran across a district attorney who wasn't Catholic, who was willing to do something. That's the real reason why he finally is in prison right now. Another example of where criminals make mistakes. There's a classic Irish perpetrator by the name of Oliver Francis O'Grady, who operated in the Diocese of Stockton, California, from 1973 all the way up into the time he was arrested in '94. And one of the things that Oliver did after he served his prison time in California at Mule Creek State Prison, he went back to Ireland, but things got too hot. So then he went over to Belgium and was putting himself forward as Frank O'Grady. Notice how perpetrators will even use or change or modify their name to try to avoid being detected. And then Father O'Grady was detected by a family, and they started making inquiries and questions, and he got spooked. And so what he did is he jumped on an airplane real quick and going back to Dublin, and he left his computer on the airplane. And in the post-9/11 world, that is Homeland Security and a security issue. So they opened up the computer, and lo and behold, what did they find? Child porn. And one of the other reasons I tell this story is because in my experience with perpetrators, child porn and child sexual abuse go hand in hand. They always seem to be in the area, around, participate, transact, and or take pictures of child porn themselves. So perpetrators are dangerous people, not only because of what they do to kids, but because of the industry that they support. And so it might honestly be easier to detect a perpetrator simply by what's on their computer. It really comes down to that. So I bring that up as just as an observation, and I really want you to remember the whole transportation element, because that may be another avenue for justice for some people.
Right. Thank you, Patrick. And so as I listen to everything that you're presenting, which is just, I mean, it's just powerful. I guess what comes to mind for me, and maybe what will also help the participants, is maybe going into the definition of the institution, because when I think back on our history, and I think of like boarding schools, you know, which for some people they like to think that was way back when, but I believe that many of the boarding schools were still going through the 60s and 70s, and I've heard you say that some cases have come forward from that era. So you know, and then thinking of, you know, one of the boarding schools is in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. So I guess there's a couple questions in there as to, you know, defining an institution. You know, can victims of child sexual abuse from those boarding schools possibly bring a suit? But I guess in looking at Pennsylvania, you would have to look to that state's law, correct?
Right. So it's a great question, and oftentimes, like you're saying, the law in the state will define institution. Here in Minnesota, I don't have the law language right in front of me, but an institution is defined as a business, an organization, a corporation, which encompasses boarding schools, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, other religious denominations, churches, community sort of organizations, big brothers, big sisters. So certainly institution has been defined very broadly. And so I encourage those who have been abused or know someone who's been sexually abused as a child to, come forward, break the silence, report to law enforcement, but also contact a lawyer to make sure you preserve your rights. And, oftentimes it's our job as lawyers to do that research and to find out who is an institution involved in this situation, who is controlling the work and the duties and the responsibilities of this perpetrator. And sometimes we can be surprised to find that there are many institutions, many, businesses or corporations or entities, organizations that control this person. So it's a good question.
Maybe one of the ways to think about it is there's an old canonical church term called in loco parentis, literally standing in the feet or standing in the place of the parent. So maybe the simplest way to boil it down is to try to see if at least it's initially there is the child basically being given to someone to protect them as if they were the parent, whether it's a daycare or a school, or sending them on a trip to the Boundary Waters canoe area like I remember doing as a kid, or going to Washington, D.C., some screwball trip I remember going on as a kid. The people who were in charge of us were in loco parentis. And that might be another way to filter it out, but probably the biggest piece of advice I would say is don't try to be the trier of fact here. It's better to ask the question and have somebody take a look at it and find out that it's not there than to allow it just to lay fallow and be quiet. Because it's only in the silence of it all that honestly perpetrators and the systems of perpetrators, they survive and thrive, just like a piece of bacteria.
Right.
So I pulled up, Rose, the language in the Minnesota law as an example. And so what they use is person, but that is to include a natural person, a corporation, a limited liability company, a partnership, an organization, an association, or other entities. So it is very broad language.
Okay. And another reason why I raised that question is because unfortunately through foster care systems, we are also seeing a lot of not only child sexual abuse, but trafficking, sex trafficking of our young Native children. And so in looking at the framework that you've just provided and have gone over, I know for at least in my mind, I'm curious about that sort of those sort of claims.
That's a very good question also. The foster care system is, like you're saying, ripe for abuse of children, trafficking. I mean, it's highly dangerous situation for children. And what we have found, it's very state specific, first of all. Second of all, the foster care system, if operated and run by the state, there can be legal complications called immunity. And when we have state organizations, state agencies that are operating the system, they can sometimes hide behind laws that are designed to protect public agencies that are arms of the state. But it's very fact specific as to the state laws And so it's certainly something worth talking to a lawyer about, because it is such a dangerous area, and really, like you're saying, common place where children are exploited and subject to violent trauma. I would add generally also, Rose, that what we do in working with survivors of abuse when they contact us, it's important to know that what we can do is both seek justice for them, but also, and what's so powerful about these laws opening up the chance for justice, is that we can use the civil justice system to expose the truth. And Patrick talked about this a bit. Because of these lawsuits, we are getting access to files and documents and a paper trail that's kept on perpetrators by those who employ them. And, you know, in the case of the Roman Catholic Church and clergy, they keep meticulous records on when a priest is caught abusing a child and how they're moved to an entirely new location when they had a history about the danger the priest posed. All of that record and paper trail is something we can go after in a civil lawsuit. So it really is an amazing chance to also expose the truth, which has been kept in the dark, and the public has been kept in the dark, and as a result, exposed to dangerous pedophiles. So it's a really good chance to both get justice for the survivor individually, but also for the greater good, to get access to the truth through documents and other ways.
Right. Thank you for that. And so I guess I have just another follow-up question with regards to the state laws. Is there a place that participants can go? I mean, I guess maybe they could just go to their own, well, is there some sort of website they can go to find out what the current laws are?
That's a great question. So we've created a slide with some resources, and one that we didn't put on here, but that is exactly a great resource to go to answer the question you've just asked, is solreform.org, solreform.org, and it's run by Marcy Hamilton, who is a professor of law in New York, and she is the biggest advocate for statute of limitations reform in the country. And her efforts, she's even written books on the topic, that the number one thing America can do to protect its children is to change the statute of limitations and reform it to make it survivor friendly. So her website, solreform.org, lists, you can search by your state, and it lists both the civil and criminal statute of limitations by state. And it also includes any pending legislation that's moving through in a state. It includes important cases, court decisions that either limit or expand the statute of limitations. So it's a really excellent resource. I'll talk briefly about the other resources we've listed here on the PowerPoint slide. Bishopaccountability.org is an equally fabulous website that is just sort of a repository for all of the files and histories and assignment histories for clergy accused of sexual abuse with minors. And it's been in existence now for maybe 10 years or so, and it's just a fabulous resource. You can search by state, you can search by diocese, you can search by a name of a perpetrator. It's specific to clergy abuse, but it is just a fabulous resource. It includes links to media coverage, So, you know, if you were at a certain parish or in a certain diocese and you want to know if a certain priest has been accused of sexual misconduct with a minor, go to a bishopaccountability.org, and it's got tons and tons of documented history, depositions, everything to do with the clergy abuse crisis in the U.S. And our website, we think, is also a very helpful place, particularly the information we can provide on these changes in the law in Minnesota, in Hawaii. We have ongoing cases in the Archdiocese in Milwaukee, which is in bankruptcy. All the other dioceses that are in bankruptcy we are involved in. We have lawyers licensed in Hawaii and around the country. And so we have maps of where perpetrators were located in Minnesota, and we've got a lot of information there for survivors. So that would be another resource we would recommend. Here in Minnesota, there's a Professor Sarah Deer, who works at the William Mitchell College of Law, and she's really a specialist in Native American laws and as they relate to child sexual abuse, and she would be a great resource. And again, what we're talking about today and what we believe to be so important is not just the criminal system, but here the civil lawsuit, the civil justice system.
Right.
Anything you want to add on resources, Patrick?
Resource-wise, the other great thing I've heard several times and read is the studies that Sarah Deer is doing specifically on sex trafficking, and that goes hand in hand in the process. There's no way to isolate any single issue. It's always grouped in multiple issues. The phenomena of sex trafficking that she's recorded just in Minnesota alone is mind-boggling, because the average citizen has absolutely no idea this is going on in any way, shape, or form. So if you've never heard of it, I'd recommend that you go there and make yourself aware of it. The other thing is the gathering in Palm Springs every couple of years that I've gone to has always proved to be a good spot. And there are several healing centers that are coming together and that are possible. And I would suggest that if you have people are of the right age, that is a place they can start. But again, if you really want, in my opinion, if you really want a Native kid to be able to, who's now middle-aged or older, who's just starting to deal with the ramifications of childhood sexual abuse, they have to go back to their language, they have to go back to their culture, they have to go back to their people, and they have to go back ultimately to the geography where they can heal. Minneapolis is an okay place, St. Paul is an okay place, and all that, but if a person is going to heal, in my experience, they have to go back from where they're from to find their roots and to basically to restart and look into and do that. So maybe this is a time, and I would hope that people would talk to their elders so they could have the public discussions, the internal discussions, so that the elders will start to talk about it so that we can actually move forward and have something happen. I noticed in many places that if the elders don't endorse it, it just doesn't happen. Mm. So I would hope that an advocate here that's listening and thinking right now and reflecting, that you may be thinking about a particular elder where you're from, to be able to approach them so that they could start the discussion and to begin the dialogue to move things forward, because the kids in this generation, the kids moving forward, are worth every single element of effort and sweat that we can provide to bring the protection that's necessary. And if we can get the elders to start to talk about it, if we can start to bring and use some of the resources that pop up along the way in time, then we can change it. We can change the trajectory, and we can make the future better for the kids, which ultimately, if you want to be selfish about it, helps us in the end.
Mhm.
Now, Patrick, you mentioned a gathering in Palm Springs that's held every year. Can you elaborate a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it's every couple of years, and it's a gathering of native tribes, and Alaska natives come, and people. I've met Oglala Sioux there. I've met natives from Oklahoma and New York, and it's about every 2 years in Palm Springs. Personally, I don't care what organization holds it or where it is. Probably not Minnesota in January, but there, wherever it happens, the gathering happens to be, so that people get together. If it's if it's like the powwows up in Duluth area in the summertime. It's to be able to go to the gatherings, to be with the people, to be with elders, I think is the way that healing starts to happen. And I'm not encouraging anyone to, put someone in a full Nelson and drag a survivor to a gathering or something, but they do need to be in touch with their family. And this is the same way it works with the Irish, of which I come from. You have to be with your people if you're going to heal. And I'll try and find the name of the gathering because I can't think of it right offhand. But it's there are so many opportunities that can happen if you put your people together and gather for the right reasons in a sacred space. It's just very powerful.
Yes.
Another organization that does gather together around this issue and around the experience of being a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, specifically by a priest, is SNAP, the Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priests. And that's a national and worldwide organization that's an advocacy group, but also a support group for those who've been abused sexually as a child. And, they started out, their mission was to bring together those abused by priests, but it's also those abused by religious or otherwise, a great support network. They have a website and they have regional representatives around the country, a great resource to go for finding, therapy references, just support groups, anything like that. I noticed the correct website of the SOL reform was posted on the question and answer section, so it's actually sol-reform.com. So thank you for that. And it looks like the PowerPoint slides will be posted on your website, Rose, so people can access those at a later time as well. And another great answering of question is the Indian Nations gathering is the annual or biannual gathering, or every 2 years, actually, I should say, in Palm Springs.
Okay. Great. So are there any other questions that folks may have?
Yeah, feel free to ask anything that comes to mind.
Oh, Sherry actually responded and said the 13th National Indian Nations Conference was held in 2012 in Palm Springs, California, and the next conference will be in December 2014. Oh, okay.
Excellent. Thank you, Sherry.
And I'm wondering, is there a website for that? I mean, there's the date, but I'm not I guess it's also in Palm Springs. It's there every.
Yeah, it's ovcinc.org.
Oh, okay.
The Office of Victims of Crime.
Okay. Okay, excellent. Well, if there are no further questions, I would just like to, here at NIWRC, would really like to thank Patrick and Sarah both so much for joining us today to talk about this important critical information, and for folks to act now, as they mentioned, that window is closing soon. So that's really important for folks to remember that. And if there are no further comments, we just want to say thank you. I don't know, Sarah, Patrick, if you had any other final comments.
Just thanks to all of you for participating and giving us a chance to talk to you about our work and what we view to be a critically important issue around the country, and hope that you can spread the word that for those sexually abused as a child, it's an important time in this country to come forward, break your silence, and know you're not alone, and that you do have rights in the civil justice system to pursue. So thank you very much for your time and attention today. We appreciate being invited to speak.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity.
Great, thank you again so much. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry, Patrick, did you have final comments?
Nope, just want to say thank you for the opportunity, because getting the word out is everything, in my opinion.
Yes. Okay. Well, thank you again so much, everybody. I hope you have a beautiful afternoon. And any other final questions that come up, we will certainly respond. And again, the webinar will be made available on our website. So again, thank you and have a great day.